confused how non-Catholics that say they live according only to the Bible, to the Scripture, yet they marry 4 or 5 times and they think it's all right, but the Bible clearly states that you don't divorce.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. The first thing that came to my mind when I saw your question pop up was the quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Right.
Wow.
And that's, because someone holds something ideologically, it in no way implies that they live consistently with what they profess. I mean, that just seems patently obvious to me. But a better question would be, can they justify it? Can they justify it? And in my experience, you get one of 2 responses to that question within Protestantism. So most of the Protestants, well, let me back up. Protestants don't have a well-defined concept of sacramental validity. Right? In the Catholic Church, we have really strict rules. We know when a sacrament is valid or not.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's easy for us to say, it's easy in theory for us to say, here's what you have to have a valid marriage. These people have a valid marriage. These other people don't have a valid marriage. Protestantism doesn't typically have marriage tribunals. They don't have a well-thought-out theology of sacramental validity. They don't believe that marriage is a sacrament. And so they never really face the question of trying to determine the question of marriage validity. That's one thing I want to say at the outset. At least they don't today. They may have at one point in time, but today that's not the case. Secondly, the Protestants that I know, the conservative, Orthodox, historic Protestants, do regard marriage as indissoluble in principle, although they allow for 2 exceptions. Catholicism allows for no exceptions. Marriage is indissoluble, period. If it's valid, it's indissoluble, no exceptions. Protestants have always allowed for 2 exceptions. One is adultery. If one spouse is unfaithful, they hold that dissolves the bonds of matrimony. Okay. So a great number of people get divorced on the grounds that they were the subject to infidelity. Their spouse was unfaithful. I encountered a man one time, blew my mind actually, who was actually guilty of infidelity. So he's the one that committed adultery, and he interpreted that Protestant position as grounds for his divorce. Since he had been unfaithful, he had broken the bounds of matrimony, he was no longer bound by marriage, and he was now going to get divorced.
Wow.
That's not the way it's typically interpreted in the tradition, but I did meet one fellow that took that point of view. So at least some of them are going to justify their divorce on the grounds of infidelity. Another ground would be abandonment. So if someone abandons the marriage, the abandoned spouse was typically held not to be bound in such circumstances, right? But those are not the majority of cases of divorce in Protestantism. Most of them are simple incompatibility, right? They just decide they don't want to be married anymore, and off they go. And so because they don't have a good concept of validity, what most Protestants tend to do with that is to say, okay, it's objectively wrong, but you've said you're sorry, you've repented, try not to mess up the second one. And that's the way they typically handle it. And so if somebody were to divorce and remarry multiple times, it would be like, well, that's, it's pretty shameful, but, would you finally pick one and stick with it, bud? Would be sort of the attitude. Now, the other approach would be to take a more liberal view and just say, these strictures against divorce in Scripture are really not applicable to us. And to just let one's ethic be dictated by the spirit of modernity.